Moduls Rīga piedāvā.
I began publishing when I was still in high school. So I started selling the first pieces when I was 17. My parents had to sign the contracts because I was not of age. I was a minor. So I began writing probably 14, 15, and sending to magazines. So from a very young age. I was always a reader, and when I ran out of things to read, I started writing. And I'm still a big reader. I read maybe 120 novels a year, 140, depends on the year. If I'm very busy working, last year I had a lot of work, this year I have a lot of work, and work and travel eats into my reading time. I read and write in many different genres. And I like mixing elements from one genre to the other, or if I do anthologies, I like including writers from other genres to try and cross-pollinate ideas, readerships. There are not so many things that are that groundbreaking or new or inventive. Science fiction definitely is one area where some writers really are doing something completely unknown before. But there are things, there's an American novel that I like very much by a writer named Tova Mirvis. She wrote a novel called The Ladies' Auxiliary. It's a novel, most of the books about a closed community are written from the stranger's point of view. So it's a stranger comes to a closed community. This is a book about the Orthodox Jewish women's community in Memphis, Tennessee. So it's a closed community in an area that's not known for the Jewish community. So it's a minority within a minority situation. And the novel's written in first-person plural from the community's point of view about what happens when the stranger comes to the community. And to me, that was something that was something new in literature to do it that way. So the technical aspect of writing in the first-person plural from the community's point of view was something I'd never seen before, and was to me something completely new and a new way of telling something. And I thought she did it very well. She didn't do the Hollywood ending. You know, it's not the stranger comes to the closed community and saves everything or changes everything. You know, both the woman who comes to the community is affected by the community, and the community is affected by her. But it wasn't an easy, simple Hollywood type of ending. So that to me made it a very good book. It has enough of an ending and enough closure, but the community survives in many ways, affected by but not totally changed by the person. I mean, many times, especially in my own work, I tend to use a lot of fairy tales, so I tend to do new versions of very old stories and very archetypal stories. And I think that also, so sometimes you have something that is completely new, and sometimes you have something that's a new version of something very old. They're all different ways of communicating, or I mean, in many ways there's a familiarity of knowing the story. You know, like with the fairy tales, we know these stories so well, so when you have suddenly the variation, that creates the reader has expectations because they know the traditional fairy tale, and so when you suddenly have any variation, then it that sets up a literary or artistic tension right away. So, and I think that can be interesting to play with. Those archetypes, especially the fairy tales or the mythology, are such powerful stories as humans. I mean, these are stories that very often repeat in all different cultures. Many cultures that have never met, they find that they have similar mythologies or similar types of stories. And so, to me, those are powerful tools to have in our creative toolkit, as it were. I believe in our commonalities. I mean, we're all unique, but I tend to look for what is similar between us all. So, but I'm naive, I think.
And what's the difference between poetry and prose, in your point of view?
For me, very often it's a compression and a condension of language and experience in poetry that's different than character in prose. Even though I'm very often a narrative poet, but the metaphoric leaps that you make in poetry is different than what you could do in prose. Even microfiction, where you have sometimes you can have poems that are longer than fictions, but the narrative technique is different. So how the story is told, what's being told, sort of the lyrical moment is very different in poetry. I'm a fairly in both Spanish and English, when I write, I tend to be more a poet writing about a moment or an observation or a way of seeing things differently. Some things, I mean, even just thinking in different languages changes how we, or language affects how we can think. Like in Spanish, there's a word, one of my favorite words in Spanish is called escampar. Escampar is the moment when if it's been raining, the moment it stops raining. And that was something that to me is such a poetic word that I didn't know, that doesn't exist in English. I mean, to say in English, the moment it stops raining and the sky goes from cloudy to clear, I never had the concept until I learned it in Spanish. And to me that seeing the world in that different way, that's a poetic moment to me. So for me, poetry would be about something like that. Even if you include that in a story, that's still a poetic moment for me in my way of seeing things. I'm not a very avant-garde or experimental poet in terms of language or breaking down structure. So I can read that. Sometimes I enjoy it, sometimes I don't enjoy it. I translate it. As a translator, I'm a very big fan of punctuation, so sometimes when I translate experimental poetry, it's difficult where you don't know grammatically what is going on, and especially because English and Spanish are not, they're syntactically very different. There are things that, or you can have double meanings in one language that you can't transfer to the other, and you need to know, is it this or is it that? Both as a writer and a translator, I wind up, I can write pieces I don't like. You know, I mean, sometimes it's the same way like a journalist. Even though I don't do a lot of journalistic writing, I can create poetry or fiction about something on commission, and I've done this many, many, many times. This is sort of one of the things of being a freelance, a creative person in today's world, that sometimes you have to make a living as well as being creative. So yes. It's better if I like it. Sometimes, especially with the translations, there's things like there are different philosophies. Some people say you have to read the whole book before you translate it. I like to not read the whole book because then I want to know what happens next. So I keep. You then just have to revise very heavily. So I mean, there are things that you need to know later on in order to make sure that you don't give something away, or that, you know, but at least for the first draft, I like not to know what's going to happen, so it keeps me going. The newest book I wrote is 100 erotic microfiction that I wrote in Spanish, and someone else is doing the translation into English, and so as she's working on things, she's been finding mistakes that we're making note of to correct for the next printing. So it's already in the third printing, but for the fourth printing, we will correct it. And it's something where the book had the second and the third printing and was not fixed because on the one hand it sold very well, and so they reprinted very quickly, but also it hadn't been read with the attention that a translator pays to the text before. So even though it was copy edited, there are mistakes that the copywriter doesn't notice, but that the translator can't not notice. I mean, the translator really has to go over everything and understand everything in order to be able to translate it. So I have a small publishing house called the Midsommar Press that publishes only poetry. So it's one of those things where technology has changed so much over time. It's now affordable enough that as badly paid as writers and translators are, I can take a little bit of that money and put it into this cultural project. So we're not funded by anybody else. It's funded out of money I earned from writing and translating for other publishers. And we publish a few different imprints. One is called Fabula Rasa, of mythic poetry. As I mentioned, that mythology and fairy tales, those archetypes are very important to me. One is called Body Language, which is devoted to LGBT voices. Very often gay, lesbian, transgender voices aren't finding a means to be published or come to an audience at many other houses. And so that's one area that we're publishing, and it's one of the areas that sells best for us. I think that often there are readers who want to read about these experiences that aren't finding those voices in other places. And we have a new imprint called Periscope that publishes women poets in translation into English. We began that imprint in 2014, and the 2 previous years before we started, when we were thinking about this, everything translated, fiction, poetry, non-fiction, from all languages. Only 26% were by women authors. So there's a very large imbalance. There are many women's voices that we're not getting in English. So I created this imprint to try and redress that. So they're all women who've published at least 2 books. One of the first 3 had published over 40 books in her country before she had a book in English. So they're established, they're already recognized voices in their native language, but hadn't yet made it into English. I think a good poem would be a poem that evokes a response from a reader. It's not a bad poem if it only has one reader. I think that there's this idea that we have to write for the biggest audience that's possible, but sometimes writing for one particular person can be, having an effect on one person can be more powerful than having, there's many bestsellers that are insipid. They don't affect anybody. People read them, but sometimes they're not even very bad. They're just not good and not bad. They're just blah. But if you have something that inspires or moves even just one reader, I think that's a good poem. And not every reader is the right reader for a poem. So this is something that I may not like, may be the perfect poem for you or for a different reader, and that's fine. I think that not everything needs to appeal to all readers. I think it's important to read widely. I read lots of things, and lots of things that I don't like. And I think it's good to read things I don't like, because then it's a way of reinforcing or cultivating what my own taste is, as opposed to depending on other people to say, this is good and this is bad. So this is one of the reasons why I like to read in many different genres and say, this is good and this is bad, as opposed to literature with a capital L, that only this is literature and everything else is inferior or just text as opposed to literature. So there's good writing and bad writing in all genres. Over the years, my writing, I hope, has gotten better. So there are things that I'm embarrassed about. My first book, published when I was 24, 25, 26, somewhere like that. I look at those stories now and I'm often embarrassed by them, but I know that people still respond to them. So I know that I write differently now. I'm still naive, I think, but I'm not less naive. So there's sort of a youthful innocence or a youthful... I think when I was younger, there was more... or I was able to tap into more the naked wish fulfillment that many readers have. That's what makes a lot of young adult literature very popular. And I don't find that now. I think my life experience colors so much more what I write. At the same time, I'm hopefully more mature as a person, and I'm able to abordar, to tackle relationships with different subtleties, or more, hopefully my personal maturity and the relationships I've had inform how my characters react with one another in different ways. My tastes also have changed tremendously as a translator, and especially as someone who's made a shift from writing in my mother tongue to my stepmother tongue. How I write and how I read is definitely very informed by those differences. So the first book that I published under my own name was a book called Switch Hitters: Lesbians Write Gay Male Erotica and Gay Men Write Lesbian Erotica. And this was a book where I wanted to explore the question. It was an anthology of different writers, and the idea of the book was to explore: do we feel desire more for the same-sex relationship, or more for the gendered body, the male body or the female body? I think that in this book, the men wrote, or the women were able to write very convincingly from a gay male point of view. There's much more, especially in erotica, there's a codified language or way that, especially in the erotic magazines and things, that gay men write about sex or talk about sex. And so I think the women were able to write from male experience and male voices much more convincingly, but they wrote less interesting, more generic gay erotic stories. The men wrote more inventive stories, and they wrote less well about the female body. So very often they were moving through the world as men, even with, so I always say a lot of men who write female characters write as jocks and frocks. So they're like a football player that just happens to be in a dress, but they don't move through the world in a woman's body. This is something where a lot has to do with power, I think, that we live in a male-dominated world, and especially straight white men who hold power are not used to feeling vulnerable. And so that's one of the things that their characters sometimes suffer from, that they move through the world from a position of power that they don't otherwise have. Not that there can't be power for women, but I, for instance, as a gay man, when I walk down the street, I know that I'm not in the power-dominant position, so I'm doing what's called risk assessment. So I'm always alert for possible aggressors. This is something I know a lot of women do. This is something that many straight white men especially don't do, because they're used to feeling powerful when they move through the world at all times. And that comes through in the writing. Whereas it's much easier for women writers to write up the power lines. We live in a male-dominated world, so a woman has to know what it's like to be male, and also her experience. The same, I'm a gay man. I was raised heterosexual by default, so I know heterosexual experience as well as my own experience. So it's probably easier for me to write up the power lines to write a heterosexual story than it would be to write down the power lines where you have so much assumed privilege from the power position that it's harder to recognize and strip away those privileges to write from that other experience. All literature creates empathy for other people, for other characters, for other cultures. Literature is the connection and the similarities between all of us. I think that's one of the reasons why I write, and that's certainly one of the reasons I read. And it's one of the reasons why, as a reader, as a person, if I don't read for a long period of time, I get depressed. We get one life, but through books we get many, many lives that we can experience. So